This week on To the Contrary.
First, how are President Trump's never-ending derogatory descriptions of women affecting women's status? Then, women of color and progressive Republicans push for a pink and blue wave.
Welcome to the Contrary, a discussion of news and social trends from diverse perspectives. Up first, horseface, Pocahontas.
These are just a few choice words from President Trump, who used them to refer to women who oppose him. Earlier words include lowlife, fat, and ugly. This week, in a tweet, Trump called adult film actress Stormy Daniels horseface after a defamation lawsuit she brought against him was dismissed. Trump also refers to Senator Elizabeth Warren as Pocahontas because she claims some Native American heritage. Trump said he'd donate $1 million to her favorite charity if she proved her heritage. But this week, when she presented proof of some Native American heritage, Trump refused to make good. Earlier, he had mocked Christine Blasey Ford and her testimony at the Kavanaugh hearing. On a 60 Minutes interview last weekend, Trump said he wouldn't have won the nomination but for these kinds of comments. These insults don't sit well with Democratic women, but Jennifer Lim of Republican Women for Progress says they also offend Republican women.
We've seen what Donald Trump has done, and I think that, even though they did hope for the best with Donald Trump, and, they have been voting Republican all their life, we saw what he could do, and especially on how he's devaluing women. Every type of woman, that has only gotten worse, and women especially are tired of it, and tired of having the Republican Party especially not push back when he does things like that.
Trump says women stand behind him. He uses 2016 exit polls that show he won with 52% of the white women's vote compared with 43% for Hillary Clinton. But now comes a more reliable and new analysis from the Pew Research Center that used verified voter records. Pew finds Trump still slightly ahead of Clinton among white women voters, but the numbers are different, 47% to 45%.
So, Representative Edwards, how does the president's demeaning of women in this public way, if at all, affect women's status in society?
Well, I think increasingly the views that the president holds on women are pretty baked in to where women are, and which is why you see more Republican women, independent women, certainly Democratic women leaning toward Democrats and against Trump.
I think it's terrible, it's disgusting, and I don't like hearing any of it. And I think that it should also open our eyes to sort of the larger conversation in which public figures are saying all sorts of terrible things and acting in a bad way towards women. It goes beyond party lines.
Yeah, I mean, I think this does enable sort of men who already have this kind of attitude toward women to be able to use this kind of language sort of freely and openly. But I would also say that there's a flip side that's helping, I think, more women to have this conversation with men about how horrific it is to always be discussed with regard to our appearance.
I think you're seeing, thanks to the president, a hardening of discourse in this country. I think whether it relates to women and the things that he's saying about women, or whether it's literally just a byproduct of the environment that we're in, I think he's contributing a great deal to sort of the diminished sort of role that women are seen in culture.
Do you think it's affecting uneducated women more than educated, let's say high school or less educated women, as opposed to college educated women? Or are the less educated, as he puts it, I love less educated people.
Well, I think,
are they getting hit by this more?
Well, I think that we've seen that his support falls more along different demographics, not just gender, right? It's on education, and it's on rural versus urban, and it's income level, right? That gender is just sort of a byproduct of all of that. I do think that in sort of to
A byproduct of all of that means
of education and of these other demographic variables, as opposed to just being that this is a woman versus male kind of thing, because it's not. We know that there's racial divisions. We know that there's education divisions. But ultimately, yes, lower education, lower income women support Trump more. But I think the bottom line is that I do think that there's been a coarsening of our rhetoric. I think it's horrible. But I think it's also helpful if we can all step back then and say, you know, there have been a lot of Democrats this year. There have been a lot of Republicans this year who have been found themselves in trouble and a lot of hot water because of sexual assaults, because of sexual harassment, because women who have stood by, you know, male chiefs of staff who they knew were doing things. So perhaps it's a good opportunity for everyone now to say, hey, you know, we are in 2018. It's time to have a different conversation about women.
Well, I do think that the demographic shifts in the country actually don't portend well for the Trumps of the world. And it's not going to happen now, but I think over this period of time, you know, more young people just don't think like that. And I think that that is going to begin to weigh in on our politics. And what we hope is that this kind of language doesn't translate into the kinds of concerns that women who have less education, maybe in rural communities, have in their workplaces and in their homes. We don't want it to stick.
Well, you look at the polls all of the time. How much of it is sticking already?
Well, I think,
and how much of it may have helped create the Me Too movement, because the women who heard it and didn't want to put up with it said, wait a second, you know, this has got to stop.
right. I mean, I do think there is a sort of generational cultural moment of enough is enough. But I would also say that we shouldn't forget that our sort of entertainment culture has also gone through this unbelievable coarsening. I mean, if you're watching any of the sort of
music
manufactured, but there is a manufactured reality show, right? As though it's authentic, but it's not, it's all scripted. And most of it involves this kind of coarse language, these kinds of insults, and to a certain degree, the president is more reflective of that than I would argue that he's in fact leading it. The problem is that we hear his rhetoric much more than we hear some of that other entertainment dross.
Well, actually, I don't mean to jump in, but I was thinking the exact same thing. But I think that some of us here in Washington who maybe aren't listening to like the top charts and watching, you know, every kind of TV show out there are sort of surprised when we're hearing the president speak this way. But I have put on music with my children and turned it off and thought, oh my goodness, this is what's happening. This is what most people are hearing all the time. And so I do think that maybe we're feeling more surprised because we live in a little bubble here in Washington, but that's not, unfortunately, what a lot of Americans are.
But do you think it's affecting women's, I mean, we've read, there are lots of divorces that have happened over the Trump presidency with, you know, the men supporting him and the women being entirely offended by this guy. Do you think it's being inculcated by some women who are saying, well, you know, that's okay, or, you know, their husbands laugh it off, or their boyfriends, whatever, and so they laugh it off?
I do think that's something to be concerned about, and I think that in the segment was pointed out again, I think the assumptions that we make is that Democrat women are infuriated by the president's behavior, his rhetoric, his commentary, and I think there is a large portion of Republican women who feel the same way too, and maybe because I live in the D.C. bubble, I feel that way, but I talk to plenty of Republican women who find their rhetoric sort of aberrant, and I think to your point, the part that concerns me even more is that we almost become immune to it to some extent because we live in this bubble, we're exposed to it all the time. And that's not healthy for culture, it's not healthy for women, it's not healthy for our politics to think that we're in a place where, oh, he said a horse face? Nah. You know what I mean? What does that mean? That's the president, we've elected him, and this is where he's coming out when it comes to issues like this.
Right, and but do you think, for example, any women in the workplace, are they suffering more abuse by their male bosses because of the president's attitude? Has it bled into society
I think
that way?
That's the part that we really don't quite know yet. But I think one of the things that's going to happen on November 6th is we're going to see what that gender gap really is. And I believe that the president's language, his constant demeaning of women, and the declarative sentence, the president is a misogynist, is going to play out in this election, and we're going to be able to see some of that.
All right. Let us know what you think. Please follow me on Twitter @BonnieRBay. Behind the headlines, women's movements before the midterms. There is the inaugural She the People Summit, billed as the first national gathering for women of color involved in progressive politics. And there's Republican Women for Progress. With the 2018 midterms around the corner, experts agree that Democrats can only achieve their dream of a wave election if they activate these key voting blocks.
We're the king and queen makers of the Democratic Party. No one is going to be winning a House seat, a governor's statewide seat, a Senate seat, or winning a presidency for the Democrats without the enthusiastic, consistent, sustained, and high vote turnout of women of color. We as a group are the most progressive at the polls, and Black women, as a subset of women of color, are the most loyal Democrats. That all matters, and it's time that the rest of the Democratic Party, and frankly, the country, recognize that.
Amy Allison hosts the podcast Democracy in Color and founded She the People.
The strategy is to empower a multiracial progressive coalition. We call it the New American Majority. That's the majority of all voters. It's the same people who elected and reelected Barack Obama. And most recently, I founded She the People to focus on women of color who are the country's strongest progressives and are the core of the New American Majority.
Jennifer Lim co-founded Republican Women for Progress, formerly Republican Women for Hillary.
We actually have our Women to Watch list this year, where we've been highlighting different women, Republican women who are running for office. And so many of them are minorities, which is amazing. But the sad part is a lot of minorities don't really feel at home in the Republican Party for obvious reasons. And so we're trying to make them feel like their voice is important in this election.
Lim believes there's not much room in the current Republican Party for women and the issues that matter most to them. The organization is running ads in 10 congressional districts supporting Democrats, not Republicans.
We have a lot of amazing people coming out of the Democratic Party, especially right now.
As the country's politics become more polarized along racial and gender lines, concerns grow about voter suppression. Democrats accuse Republicans of relying on tactics that make it harder to vote and purging voter rolls to maintain their majority in Congress, even as the demographics of America continue to change. One case of alleged voter suppression making national headlines is in Georgia, involving Stacey Abrams, who could become the first female African-American governor.
You got Stacey Abrams, who is running a fantastic campaign that brings more people, people who are not frequent voters, brings them into the campaigning and brings them into the democratic process. She's deeply inspiring to voters of color, and Georgia is majority voters of color. And then you have Brian Kemp. Brian Kemp is the current Secretary of State, and he has a long history of taking people off the voter rolls, literally taking people off. There was a recent, last week, a study that came out that showed that over the life of his time as Secretary of State, he's removed over 1 million people from the voting rolls.
Republicans say they're only taking more precautions to prevent voter fraud, but Democrats call voter fraud a myth. Republican Women for Progress say they're just excited about the Abrams candidacy.
We haven't gotten too much into voter suppression, but, I think I'm really excited about candidates like Stacey Abrams, and hopefully everybody can get out to vote in all of these critical elections. And when I think about her, I just think about this new brand of candidate we're seeing. I think she's so emblematic of how tired people are of these politicians who are only focusing on party ideology, and somebody like Abrams really brings a fresh look.
Allison says beyond winning or losing races, 2018 has been a great year for women of color. That in terms of gaining influence and creating the infrastructure needed to affect the future.
I've declared 2018 the year of women of color. It truly is a year that women of color came into their, what I call, fierce and loving leadership and collective power.
So, Jen, you're a Republican consultant. Do you think she's right?
I think that the challenges that we face, and I'll be honest personally, I don't like to be the only one in the room a lot of times, and I'll say as a Republican woman who's a minority and an African American, I find it challenging. I think our party has some work to do, and frankly, in this environment, what scares me even more is that, the environment, the rhetoric, the dialogue, you see what's happening in Arkansas with French Hill and the sort of the racial tropes that are used, don't facilitate a lot of interest in recruiting female Republican women who are minorities to be a part of the Republican Party.
But what do you see on the Democratic side? Is this going to be the year of women of color?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it is, and I think the hard part for me is understanding why we're still behind as Republicans to sort of catch up to that conversation. I think there are obviously reasons why I'm a Republican that are important to me and my values, but the fact that 4% of black women voted for Donald Trump tells you a lot about sort of the work we would have to do to get more African American women to engage in the Republican Party, and we're never going to quite get to where we need to go as long as the environment doesn't facilitate that.
With the work you would have to do, what is the Republican Party at this point? Because ever since the Big Tent, the days of Lee, I can't remember, Atwater, back in the, what was that, the 80s or something, the Republicans have been trying to re-become the party of Lincoln and have a lot of persons of color under the tent. But under Trump, is any work being done to advance minorities and get more of them into the party?
I tell people when I speak, it's like the holy grail. I think baby steps is getting more Republican women elected to Congress and in federal office and engaged in policy. And I think the next step would be getting more minority women. I think we had some strong candidates this cycle, but again, on the Republican side, there's a money factor, there's a motivation factor, and when it comes to minority women candidates, one of the things that we're seeing is we had several that ran this cycle, but there was nowhere near the intensity level that they have on the Democratic side.
When you say there's a money factor, the president announced this week his war chest for his second election, his re-election campaign is $100 million, dwarfing everybody else's at this point by multitudes of 5 and 10. So is he giving any of that money to get Republican women of color elected?
Depends on what comes out of your mouth, I think, and we're seeing that. I mean, Martha Roby's a great example of somebody, although she's not a minority, someone who was very outspoken about the president, and then when she got into political trouble, realized that she needed a lifeline, and that money came flowing in, and she said very nice things about the president. So I think some of the women that I've met with this cycle, particularly on the Republican side, I think it's very hard not to be a rubber stamp for this president and expect to get resources in return.
Well, I mean, there are two things. One, women won't achieve parity unless Republican women come more in the fold, because you cannot have a situation where the only women that are essentially representing all of the country are Democratic women. That just won't work. The other
side. But do you think this will turn out, will 2018 be the year of the woman of color?
Absolutely. I mean, do I think that Democrats have done an extraordinary job recruiting and funding their candidates and helping candidates get through the primary? And yes, are we going to see more women and more women of color in the Democratic Party? Absolutely. But that is also something of a function of midterm elections, where we know that the president's party usually does worse than the challenger party. That said, I want to just bring up some of the work that Michelle Swears has done at Georgetown. She has really found that one of the challenges for Republican women is that Republican women tend not to donate to other Republican women in the same kind of way that Democratic women donate to Democratic women. So a lot of Democratic women say, gosh, I want to give some money, to other women. Republican women say, I want to give to the best candidate, and that's not necessarily a woman.
Well, I want to talk about women of color, because I think that part of the reason that you see that 96% of black women voted for Hillary Clinton is because the Democratic Party shares their values. And the reality is that if you look across the board at the women of color who are running in this election, God love them, because it wasn't because they were supported in their primary elections by the Democratic Party. And so I think there's still a lot of work the Democratic Party has to do. And so in exchange for the votes,
funding their campaigns?
Funding their campaigns, but in exchange for the votes of black women, of women of color, has to come power and real leadership and a place at the decision-making table. And that's where I think 2018 is going to be a real difference maker.
Well, if they retake the House, and if, as is widely expected, Speaker Nancy Pelosi steps down after 2018, after the next election, is there any chance? Is there any woman of color in the House who could become Speaker, could replace her?
Well, I'm not going to make predictions on that right now because I think the field for that kind of race is wide open. But what I will say is that women of color, and particularly elected women, are demanding a seat at the decision-making table, and not just for votes and not just to fill out an empty chair at the table, but really to make decisions. And I think there is where the voices of women of color are making a difference in this election cycle. Somebody like Stacey Abrams. Stacey Abrams was not the chosen candidate in Georgia. She pushed through and she ran anyway. She wasn't recruited, she ran herself. And that is true for so many other women of color and particularly black women who are running in this election cycle. And I think that they are going to be the ones to say, here's what our leadership looks like. Let them define it.
And I think, to both of your points, I think this is, this may be, some of this wave may be the sort of a direct response to Trump's presidency, but it would not be this much of a wave had the Democrats not had this foundation for years, in which it's very clear, and I know I've been saying this on this show for many years, Democrats simply take gender differences far more seriously than Republicans. And I think the study that you point to out of Georgetown is telling.
And there was another one that came out that showed that when women are on a panel like the Senate Judiciary Committee, that people feel that whatever the result is that comes out of it, like the Supreme Court, they believe that it's more fair and more trustworthy.
Right, and I think this is where I've been trying to encourage my sort of right of center friends and colleagues to think about this a little differently. Your identity, your gender doesn't have to make up your entire identity, but it is a part of our identity. It is part of how I think about policy because I'm a wife and a mother and I'm a woman. And so I think that sort of beginning to think about that will be so helpful because as we get more women in the fold, we're going to have fewer of the extremes. Because right now when we think about women running for office, we have Hillary Clinton on one end and we have a sort of a more socially conservative woman on the other end. And so people don't really we don't think about men that way, right? We don't think of just the extremes. We have all of these men in the middle. So we need to get to a point where we have more women who are bringing their perspectives in a more moderate tone.
But getting away for a second from women of color, I smiled when you were saying that because it didn't go without notice that Susan Collins, when she made her what a lot of women see, progressive women certainly see as an anti-woman speech when she said she would vote for Kavanaugh, she was flanked by two white female Republican senators.
Right.
So the visuals were there and Republicans were clearly sensitive to it.
Right. I mean, I think Republicans in some respects have grown quite a lot. And I think in other, as we talked about a few minutes ago, we have a lot of work to do. And I think there's a lot of Republicans who are turned off by the kind of language that we hear out of the White House. But hopefully, we can think as individuals and not just as party.
And quickly, women of color is more than just African American women, obviously. There are Asian women, and they range from today's Chinese and Indian immigrants, who are the majority of immigrants of Asian descent, and going back to Vietnam when they were the majority of Asians coming into this country after the war. Are relationships gelling in the Democratic Party between women of different colors with each other?
I think absolutely. And in this upcoming Congress, we're going to see 2 more Muslim women who are going to join the Congress. We will likely see 2 more Native women who will join the Congress. This really does, for at least on the Democratic side, I mean, there's a wide range of real diversity within women of color, and I think and they work together, they organize together, and I think that's a good thing because the last thing that we need is to have people who are opponents to all of these issues sort of splintering, even among women of color.
Jennifer?
Part of the reason why I do this show, not only because I think you're an amazing host and I love the diverse perspectives that To the Contrary provides, is the fact that I think that people need to see more women of color who are Republicans on television, seeming rational, not yelling in the corner boxes on CNN. And so it's important for me to do that. But you also made a point about Susan Collins and about sitting sort of behind the dais and seeing Tina Smith and Shelley Moore Capito. And what I will say is that my goal and my hope is that we have more Republican women who are minorities who are at the table and in the conversation, so that when people look on TV, they don't just see Kamala Harris, they see Republican women of the same mindset and ideologies.
All right, terrific. That's it for this edition. Please follow me on Twitter and visit our website, pbs.org/to the contrary. And whether you agree or think to the contrary, see you next week.
For a transcript or to see an online version of this episode of To the Contrary, please visit our PBS website at pbs.org/to the contrary.
Be more. PBS.